pass on what you have learned.
Interview with a teacher.
Hey everyone, welcome to the video. Sean Jansen here. I heard that some of you are going to be teaching soon if you're not already, and was asked to kind of take a few questions to see if there's anything that I've learned along the way that you might find useful and help kind of pass things along. So I'll do my best and see where we go.
Let's get to know you a bit better first. What do you currently do? What did you do previously? What courses do you teach and have you taught? Do you have a teaching focus?
That's a great question to start off. So about me, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland's iSchool, College of Information Studies, where I'm getting started on the earliest parts of my dissertation work. When I'm not busy doing that, I often teach classes at the iSchool, and I'll work as an RA or research assistant on several major projects. Previous to that, let's back up a couple decades. I'm originally from the Chicago area, and like many people, I had several different kinds of jobs in and before I started my higher education journey. I worked a lot in different service sector jobs and with several different technology sector types of jobs. And so I was a late start going back to college. I was older than most of my peers when I had just started going back. And eventually I finished with a degree in business administration, focusing in public management. And a lot of those things I learned working before I got back to the classroom kind of helped shape my early formative years of just how to be a student, how to work in the classroom, how to respond to things. So much of that kind of filled in a lot of the things that I pick up along the way. After working on that, I continued in telecommunications for a little while before getting a bite for public service, where I joined the US Peace Corps. I served in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as an NGO developer. I worked in sustainable communities, building up organizations, things like that, where I really started to get an expertise for nonprofits. And I returned home to my area of Chicago, went to DePaul University to get an MPA, Master in Public Administration, focusing international public management, carrying on a lot of the sort of things I did with the Peace Corps, doing some consulting on the side. Decided afterwards, I did a few internships at places like the European Union, Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And I was doing research at those locations, really grew to like it. So decided to continue on to do a PhD, came down to the DC area, went to American University, where I started a program in public administration and didn't quite work out there for a few reasons, but I did finish a Master's of Public Policy, focusing in science and tech policy. Also at the time, I continued doing consulting in the DC area here in research, management consulting, communications, these sorts of things. And along the way, I met a few people who said, you really need to finish your PhD, and said, why don't you go check out this thing called the iSchool? I said, what's an iSchool? And the rest is history, because here I am now. So that's sort of what brought me up to today. In terms of what I teach, I typically teach mostly things that have a quantitative stats kind of focus. That's where I'm usually at. I teach 314, 627, which are the undergrad and graduate versions of statistics, data analytics. And I've also taught 466 undergrad class in technology, culture, and society. And I've supervised several independent studies for undergrad students. I've also, in addition to teaching different classes, I've also taught different styles of classes. So when I started, I often taught with a full lecture style, where students were in front and I kind of talked to them and engaged them along the way with questions, giving them assignments to do out of class. I later started using flipped classes, where students will watch pre-recorded lectures, almost like ones like these, and then we would do activities in class afterwards that can help reinforce and do a more applied learning style. I've taught, of course, on campus, and I've taught online, and I've also done hybrid versions where it's kind of a mix of online and hybrid style.
What excites you most about teaching? Why?
Ooh, this is a good one. What gets me excited about teaching? That's actually a pretty easy one for me to answer, and this is what I call the light bulb moment. The thing where you're watching the student and you're talking to them, working with them on a particular concept, and all of a sudden you can kind of see in their expressions and their demeanor, whatnot, this going from to a moment of understanding. They sort of brighten up and their eyes get bigger. People react in different ways, but there's always some sort of effect, even if it's just in the things that they say, that starts to go, ah, the aha light bulb moment. That's why I really do it. It's a really exciting thing. And I also do it because I think about paying it forward. That's one of my personal philosophies, is to pay things forward. And so a lot of people have done things for me. And so I want to do well by others. And along the way, I kind of learned that I had a little bit of a knack for teaching and helping people with these sort of things. So since this is where an area I can give, this is what I can do. And also, I've had a lot of good and not so good teaching experiences. So I want to be able to emulate that for others, and no, the good parts at least. And another thing about like what makes things exciting is just sort of, even though I might be teaching the same thing over and over again, I always get like a fresh crop of students. And so it's sort of this new little revival all the time. And it's never the same thing twice, especially since I keep evolving materials and content and things like that. So it's pretty exciting.
How did you learn or get experience about teaching pedagogy? In other words, how did you know what techniques or approaches to use for specific students, content, or mode?
Pedagogy. Ooh, that's a big fancy word. So I wouldn't say I really learned pedagogy early on, the sort of theories of learning and how to get people to work well in these sort of educational settings. It's sort of the things that I picked up along the way. In terms of things that I said earlier, that I started with a lot of work before I went to higher education and started my degrees, and I had a lot of professional experience. And one of the things that I did in some of those capacities, even when you're thinking about like the restaurant sector, right? You might be a server or something. You work your way up and you become a trainer like I did. And next thing you know, you're working with people one-on-one or in small groups to how to do specific things and how to work to regulations and code and other aspects. And I did this in a variety of different jobs in these sort of training roles. And so I saw training as sort of an analogous transferable skill into teaching. Slightly different formats, slightly different content, different things moving around, but a lot of the fundamentals are the same. So while I didn't have a formal upbringing in teaching and pedagogy, I did have a lot of things like training aspects that I sort of brought along the way. Another thing that I sort of learned was a sink or swim method. I can give an example of being in the Peace Corps about this, where one of my side projects was teaching adults to use computers who had never touched a computer before, and their kids were already picking these things up along the way at school. So we kind of had a gap to close so the parents could help their kids. And so I had to find new ways of reaching out and connecting with individuals who have come from a different culture than I do and different experiences than I do. And so finding these sorts of common grounds, finding anything from like the language I use to the materials and how I engage with these individuals, understanding things like these technology gaps between us and how I can kind of revert to the basics and the fundamentals and build them up from there. I'm very much a scaffolder and builder in my sort of teaching approach. And another thing I just sort of how I learn along the way is talking to colleagues. When it comes to things like pedagogy itself, I've learned so much more just talking to people at the iSchool that don't necessarily teach the same classes sometimes, but I often branch out to just faculty writ large and talk to them about classroom management and how to get students engaged and things like this, and different styles of learning to make sure that we're meeting all the needs that we can. To get to the part about specific needs, techniques, and approaches, so one of the things is that students, for the large part, you can use a lot of the same things with many students. That's why we get away with having, large classes with one instructor in front. But a lot of the students are also going to have specific needs. So things like office hours are going to be very important. Being proactive is going to be very important. Making sure the students feel, important and valued and not just somebody kind of hanging out in the background. And when you start to identify the student and not just a face in the crowd, you start to kind of pick up on some of the nuances of students and the idiosyncrasies that make them all unique and different. And so you start to learn that some people might be more visual or audio or tactile, different ways you can do things. And so you kind of have to sharpen up some of your tools that you bring to the toolkit to say, there's not just one way of explaining and helping somebody learn something, but just sort of picking things up in sort of a stats land. It might be drawing things out, right? I make these terrible sketches, and it helps some students where just sort of talking them through things or seeing code works for some, but not necessarily for others. And yeah.
What type of mentorships or support did you receive for teaching?
Mentorships and support, that's an interesting one because again, going back to what I was saying with some of my experiences coming into classrooms, I said that I had a lot of good and not so good experiences, and the not so good ones stick with you quite a bit. You kind of remember those sharply if you've had more negative experiences. And so I've had people reading from books as what they did in the classroom. They didn't really talk to us. They read from the book, or they read from slides. They just put a slide deck up on the screen and just start reading bullet after bullet, and that's class. I've also seen a wide range of materials that just didn't connect with me, didn't connect with my classmates, really left us scratching our heads. And I've had my fair share of instructors that were more interested in research than being in the classroom. At least that's how it came across. And they often left the job to TAs who may or may not have been feeling well equipped, may have been people just like yourselves that were unsure and might not have had the kind of guidance along the way to kind of help them fill in some of the gaps from these instructors. So learning about what not to do, I think, was just as valuable to me as learning what to do. And it was sort of a reverse mentoring, reverse support. In terms of other people and what they've done along the way, in the Peace Corps, I had this great associate country director. He went by the name Mr. Cool. He was sort of my bridge and my gateway into these communities. He was from the country, from the communities that, nearby where I was working. So he knew people, he knew how they thought and operated in organizations and how I could sort of navigate these structures. And so even though he wasn't necessarily an expert in the areas that I was working in, he definitely helped me learn a lot about how I could take the things I knew and apply them into the sort of new spaces that I'm at. And it's the same sort of thing then is like I was mentioning before at the iSchool, talking to a lot of faculty colleagues and other students who teach and things like this, where I said, hey, I'm in this new thing. Like I want to learn how to do a flip class. I've never done one before. What is this like? Right? Have you done one? And kind of learning along the way, even though they were often for radically different classes. When I was thinking a little bit more about what I do, when I think about the stats classes and things like that, when I was in my MPA studies at DePaul, I took a stats class, did pretty well in it. It was oddly the first time I really started understanding stats, and that was because of the quality of the instructor I had, D. Garth Taylor, now retired. And when I did stats in undergrad, over my head, didn't understand what the heck was going on. Can't to the day figure out how I managed to pass that class. But when I took it in the grad school, the person explained it in such a way that I had my aha moment, and other students figured out I had my aha moment, and they came to me for help. And I liked it, and I found out I was good working with this. So after I finished the class, I started talking to other people teaching the same class and asked to be a sort of volunteer TA. And so if you have the, if you ever seen a shark and the little fish that kind of swims along and underneath it, the remora that catches the little bits along the way after the shark does its thing and kind of helps clean up a little bit of mess around the shark, that was me. I was the remora to the shark teacher, and I was just gobbling up everything I could. I worked with probably 7 different teachers on these sorts of classes, picking the materials, learning styles, teaching styles, these sorts of things along the way. And so it was an informal TA type ship, wasn't officially recognized at the university. I was just sort of a tag along, and it really kind of helped shape the deeper dive into what it is that I'm working with today. I also can't forget to give a shout out to TLTC at the university here. If you haven't had a chance to connect with them, do so. They are a fantastic resource. They're really a good go-to for me, at least the group that deals with the technology side of things, like when you want to use clickers in your classroom. I've worked with some of them, and they're really a fantastic crew to kind of help get you up to speed. And I've found along the way a lot of things that don't necessarily work in the classroom with the technology tools they're providing. And so they've been very receptive to the feedback on how we can improve and do things along the way. So it's definitely a two-way street with them.
What are the major challenges that you have faced as a teacher in higher education, and how did you overcome them?
Oh, the challenges. There are always challenges. Even if you've taught the same class for years, you will always find a way, or students will find a way to challenge you. And so I'm going to share with you 3 major obstacles and challenges that I've encountered specifically at the iSchool that has sort of helped reshape how I teach or think about teaching, approach teaching, things like that. First of all, large classes. Prior coming to the iSchool, I've got almost 20 years of various teaching and training and other types of learning engagement experiences under my belt, but never had I had situations where I've had so many students, such large classes. Maybe 30 was the tops before I came to the iSchool. And now I'm in classes of 45 to 50. And this stuff doesn't scale linearly. It's more of an exponential curve. The more students you pack in there, it gets much harder, more quick. It becomes more difficult more quickly. And that goes not just for giving them the attention they need, but also grading, classroom management. It packs on. And so I had to learn to adapt to having so many people. At the iSchool, I've had anywhere from as low as around 20 something students in the class, all the way to 124, 126 was my high. And the only way I was able to deal with the really large ones was having a good instructional team. And so not only did I have to manage the students and be their instructor, but I also had to work with a group of TAs and academic peer mentors, which are these volunteer undergrads that want to help out and really get this group. I had 9 people on the instructional team. So I was also managing weekly meetings with them and making sure we were all on the same page for when they held office hours or when we're in the classroom doing live activities and we're going to the different tables. So really making sure that your instructional team is feeling confident, right? So if many of you are TAs, it would probably be a good idea to work with your instructor of record to have sort of instructional team meetings to make sure that you're really engaging with each other at the same level, understanding each other at the same level before you even get to the students. Really coming with a cohesive front and coordinated front is an ideal situation. The second thing was I had a blind student in one of my courses, and it was over a summer session at that, so it was a bit quicker. And I had never taught statistics to somebody who was blind. So we did it. The student did an amazing job, but I had to rethink and evaluate everything I did, from the speed in which I talked to how I described what was on a PowerPoint slide to recreating materials in such a way that this person's screen reader would be able to pick them up, which also was problematic for the software we're using, our studio, which our studio doesn't play nicely, at least right now, with the screen readers he was using. So really learning on how to, again, meet to individual needs, I had to kind of rethink everything from the ground up. And it was a humbling experience. And I'm actually very thankful that I had a chance to be to be introspective as well as deal with the sort of realities that would make this sort of thing possible for him to learn. Lastly, I cover my summer blitzes. So most recently, since I've been doing a lot of RA work, I've shifted my teaching to summers, where I regularly teach the stats and other classes as needed. And summer classes go at least twice as fast, right? If a normal semester is 15 weeks, summers are, around, I think, 9 for the full summer, 6 for a part summer. I could be off there a little bit, but summer ones are what I've been normally teaching, which we're crunching 15 weeks down to 6. And that is a nightmare for statistics. Some classes can do it really well. In my opinion, statistics is not one of those, but we get it done. And the only way I think I can really help make this possible for the students is I have to think of myself as like a scaffold or a ladder, something that's got a nice, strong foundation and support that they can build on, that they can they can climb up, and I will give them the tools that they can keep getting the handholds to climb higher and higher. And I just have to be a support system along the way to kind of guide them on that path. And that's really, because it's moving so fast, they really need to take the extra initiative to kind of learn the material. So I have to do extra work along the way to help make sure they're getting those light bulb moments much sooner.
How do you handle situations where, as an instructor, your students expect you to know everything about everything?
Situations where we're expected to know everything. So imposter syndrome is real, okay? If you read the article by Nicholas, he did an outstanding job talking about this sort of topic. And so, yeah, the first time you do this, the 10th time you do this, there's always going to be ways that you could question how much you know. For example, in the stats classes I mentioned earlier that we use R and R Studio, which means it's a programming software, and I'm not a programmer. I can use R fairly well, but I will often get students who do have programming backgrounds, and whether they knew R or they just picked it up really quickly along the way, they end up coding how to do some of the same techniques that we use in the class much differently. And so then I have to go ahead and learn their code, or they come to me expecting these sorts of novel and clever coding situations to address new and different things. Like they want to make a graphic in a certain way, and I don't know how to do some of those things. And so one of the things that Nicholas pointed out, and I completely agree with, is say I don't know. Right? It is completely okay and even a good thing to admit when you don't know something. And it's fine to tell them that, you'll get back to them, or if they want to learn with you along the way. But that's the second half of that is also equally important, is make sure that you find out the things that you said you didn't know. Don't leave the student hanging. Whether it's you just come back with the answer or they help you with it along the way, make sure to follow up with the student in some sort of capacity to help answer those questions. Not only will it help improve you to expand what you didn't know a little bit before, but it also demonstrates to the student that you're willing to engage in this sort of learning process, and that you're not just sweeping them under the rug and moving, brushing them off a little bit. These little bits go a long way, especially to making students feel valued.
Any advice on strengthening teaching skills? What are the ways that you did this?
How to strengthen teaching skills? Well, there are a few different things that you can do. All of them, none of them. First of all, I would say just start small, right? Take something that you've learned and explain it to somebody else. Whether or not the person knows the thing you're explaining, I don't think is as important. It might be useful if they did, but they don't have to. Really just get them to listen to you and go through this sort of process and tell them how to do things, and get feedback along the way. I remember an interesting exercise. I was in an anthropology class once, and the instructor had us write down a paragraph explaining all the steps it would take to go from a sitting position to a standing position and take 2 steps. And the type of things we got were wildly different. And so I kind of think about something like this when you want to explain and teach somebody something else, thinking about how you would do it and going through the motions. So you don't have to wait until you're in front of a classroom. Sit with your friends, sit with your colleagues and whatnot, and try a few things. The same thing could be said, if you have these sort of stage fright issues, public speaking concerns, this is another good way. Start in small groups, build it up from there. Look for other opportunities to practice speaking in front of groups, especially when those groups could be asking you questions back, just like students would do. So think about opportunities when we have research talks and practice talks with a lot of the centers and institutes. Try to get on the schedule for one. Present some sort of topic which people are assuming that you know, and then they will ask you questions about the thing that you talked to them. It's a little microcosm of teaching, but I think could work really well. And also teaching, some, especially if you ever watch my class, might think that teaching is almost a little bit more like entertainment, because I can get a little silly, but I think playing board games and card games where a little bit of like improv and spontaneous reaction are needed are a good thing, because you might get so concerned about what you know and what you don't know that you sort of get on these edges a little bit. But at the same time, what you need to do is just sort of smooth yourself out and be able to answer things off the cuff, react to how the classroom is moving, react to how students are answering questions, react to when they talk to you during office hours, a different environment from the classroom or via email. All of these different ways and formats that you could be interacting with students. Being able to be flexible to this and responsive to this. Playing games, I think, that keep you on your toes is a good way to help keep them on their toes and keep things moving back and forth. Another thing I would just say is, I said sometimes I get a little silly. Think about your style versus substance. So oftentimes I teach with memes and cartoons because I'm teaching a subject that most people, just run the opposite direction from, right? Stats is not a class that most people want to do. And so I'm trying to find ways to make it interesting and engaging. And so thinking about how I can teach things through humor and through other devices in the classroom that will connect with the students, I think is another way to kind of help strengthen these teaching skills. It's, teaching through a cartoon It might not necessarily be a skill in of itself, but it's going to help you with everything else along the way. I'm not saying you need to teach with cartoons. Different classes, different vibes, different instructors bring different ideas to the table, and a lot of them are good. So talk to people, see what works for them, and try different things. I almost forgot to add that in addition to just sort of like trying different places to teach, try different diverse groups, right? Because students are going to come from all walks of life and different experiences that they're bringing to the table. It's a really good thing for you to diversify the groups that you're practicing with and teaching with. And even if your classes don't have as much diversity as you think, go different places. Try to lead a workshop somewhere. Go somewhere where you're going to have different types of students, and they're going to challenge you in different ways. And that, I think, is going to help strengthen up and build some of those skills. So while not necessarily a specific skill, it's definitely an environment where you're going to exercise these skills.
Anything else that you would like to share?
Lastly, anything else I would add? I would say, first of all, take advantage of all the resources you can. I mentioned things like talking to your colleagues, and those could be faculty members, they could be fellow PhD students. Just take advantage of anybody who's been in front of a class, whether it's a TA or a full instructor, doesn't matter. It's a very low bar ask just to kind of go up to somebody and start up a conversation about these sorts of things. Many people like myself, we're more than willing to have these chats. The other thing is to don't get so hung up on the technical aspects of pedagogy, theories of learning and things like that. I didn't know them when I first started. I didn't know them for decades, the sort of formal aspects of these things. It wasn't really until I came to the iSchool, and a few years before that, when I was doing some TA work, that I started learning about these ideas of formal learning. You just go out there and get started and start working with people and see what comes natural, see what doesn't, that you need to work on a little bit, see how people respond to you, and just go and do it. Go and teach, and it'll get better from there.